And today we're very honored to have Mr. Kevin Washburn, who is the Assistant Secretary of Indian Affairs at the United States Department of Interior. He was nominated in August 2012 by President Barack Obama to become Assistant Secretary of Indian Affairs. His nomination was unanimously confirmed by the U.S. Senate on September 21st, 2012. Previously, he served as the Dean of the University of New Mexico School of Law and is a former federal prosecutor, a trial attorney at the U.S. Department of Justice. So we're very honored this afternoon to have Mr. Kevin Washburn with us. So if you could help me in welcoming him this afternoon.
Thank you. So I have to follow that. You guys are always trying to get back at the BIA, aren't you? Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Kevin Washburn. I am a member of the Chickasaw Nation of Oklahoma and currently serving as your Assistant Secretary for Indian Affairs. I have been to this meeting several times over the years. The first one I attended was in the 90s, and I've been to it here in Palm Springs. I think this is my fourth time, and it's a great place. I really love being among this community, and so it's really good to be here and see Bonnie and Jim Claremont and Sarah Deere and so many friends that I don't see all that often, don't see nearly often enough. Okay. I've met a lot of very committed people here over the years, and I always leave the conference inspired. I've also met some very memorable people here. I remember I got to sit next to Vine Deloria Jr. for lunch one time at this conference, rest his soul. And it is very much my pleasure to be here today with so many committed and passionate people who are working to protect our victims, provide justice, and bring healing to Native people. I always leave this conference inspired, and Mike, Lisa, and Don, thank you for that. You continue to inspire me. I really appreciate it. I have been involved in this kind of work, both as a participant in the criminal justice process, as a federal prosecutor, and then also as an observer and a critic when I was a law professor. And I'm going to look back and tell you that we have come a very, very long way. And thinking back across those conferences that I've been to, when I've come to this, we've really come a long way over that time, and I think I've heard somebody else say it. My assignment today is to talk about the federal role in safety, justice, and healing, and I've got strong views of the federal role in justice, safety, and healing in Indian country. And the bottom line about the federal role for me is that the federal government needs to be much more like each of you who work to help victims healing. The calling, thank you. The calling that so many of you have answered is literally to restore human beings, to help them heal, to help them to achieve the all-important transition from victim to survivor. You play different roles in that regard, but that's a goal that almost everyone in this room shares. And the federal government must work to model your behavior. The government's job is to do that not just for individual victims, but for whole communities, for Indian communities, and to help to restore tribal sovereignty and restore Indian communities. And I have been around the federal government long enough to see great progress in this. So when I first came to this conference, it was the time when we were really first starting to focus on victims. The 90s, the late 80s, and the 90s were when that really started to happen. And that was really a great step forward. It was the early years of proper victim witness programs when the Department of Justice then started to establish tribal liaisons to work better with tribes, and when it began appointing tribal prosecutors as special assistant U.S. attorneys. And I remember the days of Janet Reno, the Attorney General, who really started to focus, one of them who started to focus a lot more in this area. And I was actually part of the surge of Indian people that they hired to become federal prosecutors in Indian country. And so I got to see some of this work and got to be on the front lines with some of you. I had some really, really tough cases. One of the ones that impacted me more than most is a case that went to trial of a young man, 15 years old, who had been sexually assaulted by his 26-year-old uncle. And that was a person that he should have been able to trust. And the hardest part about that case was that it went to trial. And the hardest part was trying to convince a 15-year-old to get up in a court. And I know that some of you have been in federal courtrooms before, and that is such a formal and alien environment to your average 15-year-old Indian young man. And it's full of strangers, jurors, alternate jurors, bailiff, court reporter, lawyers, of course, deputies, witnesses, the judge, and the defendant himself sitting with his own lawyers. And to ask that young man to talk about the thing that was the worst thing that may have ever happened to him in his life in front of all those strangers in the formal environment of a federal courtroom was just agonizing. And that young man did testify, and he did a great job, and the defendant was convicted and sentenced to prison. And that young man's bravery has always sustained me, because I've never done anything as hard as what he had to do. And so I found this work extremely inspiring. And whenever I'm feeling a bit overwhelmed, I always think back to that brave young man, that 15-year-old boy who got up in a federal court, sat in the witness stand, and talked about those issues. And I know that bravery that you see every day is a lot of what keeps all of you going too. And each other is what helps to keep you going. And it's good for this conference. I'm so grateful to Jerry for continuing every year, every other year, to keep this but he works every year to make sure it happens. And I'm grateful that we have this conference. It was gratifying to see justice done in that case and every other case that I prosecuted, but I had a lingering concern that developed in me as I did that work. And one of them was that federal courts were always full of people, most of whom were strangers to Indian country. The jurors didn't come from Indian country. They tended not to come from Indian country. I think I only had one Native American ever on any of the juries of any cases I tried in federal court, and most of the cases came from Indian country. And from the judge to the jury to the law enforcement officers, there were always some Indians involved, but at some level, but they didn't live in Indian country typically. And I had a problem with that, in part because when the defendant stood up and was pronounced guilty, that defendant wasn't feeling the sting of the pain of his community. That jury didn't represent the conscience of his community. It represented the conscience of a different community. And so he didn't have to really face the music in the way that he would have if that jury had come from Indian country. It was really entirely a foreign community, outsiders to Indian country. And I also thought it was somewhat paternalistic to have a justice system made up of outsiders who were to deliver justice to Indian country. So when I became a law professor, I started writing about that. And I couldn't understand why the self-determination principles that have worked so well in so many different other areas like healthcare and education, why they couldn't also be used to bring more accountability to Indian people and improve the system in Indian country. And back then it was just sort of assumed that all serious cases had to go to the federal government. What I said back then was sort of radical, but there were a lot of people working in similar areas. Sarah Deere back then was working with Amnesty International and producing a very important report with Bonnie Claremont and others. And I thought that tribes should be part of the solution to that problem, the problem of domestic violence and sexual violence in Indian country. And I started writing law review articles about that and talking about that with other people, and explaining that self-determination is important in these other areas of Indian policy, but it's perhaps most important in the area of criminal justice, much more important than some of these other areas. And I can assure you that no one but my tenure committee and my mother read those law review articles, and Judge Pauly over there. Thank you, Judge. But the idea started to get some traction because of the work that so many other people were doing around trying to solve these issues. And then this new administration came in, and Attorney General Eric Holder had a listening conference in St. Paul, Minnesota in 2009. And before you know it, we had the Tribal Law and Order Act of 2010 that extended felony jurisdiction to tribes if they want to accept it. And the very radical idea, enacted in 2013, that tribes even have jurisdiction over non-Indian offenders in certain cases. And so what I've seen over the years, just since I've been involved in this work, is I saw great improvements in the way the federal government works with tribes. And the federal government is doing better than ever when it takes the lead. But it's also a much better partner with tribes in pushing tribes forward and pushing tribes up. And President Obama and Attorney General Eric Holder are doing even better. and we are restoring power to tribal communities so that they can solve a lot of these problems themselves. And we have learned that tribes can be in the driver's seat and should be in the driver's seat in these cases. In my short career of less than 25 years, I'm also young. Like my predecessor up here, I'd like to let you know that I'm young too. But I have been doing this for about 25 years, and in those 25 years, and since I've been coming to this conference, I've seen a lot. And I have to say, I was at the Martin Luther King Memorial the other day, and I looked at one of the quotes, and the quote was that the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice. And it was really resonant with me because this is an area here, this community proves that. The work that's been going on in this area really has bended towards justice, and I think that's a good thing. So the role of the federal government is really to be much more supportive of Indian tribes, and that, frankly, ultimately, that will be its primary role. And that role is important. Lately, we've had so much good momentum developed. I'm so pleased by the report that was issued last year by the Indian Law and Order Commission and the report just last month by the Task Force on American Indian and Alaska Native Children Exposed to Violence. And I don't know if you've seen that report. They've been passing around the executive summary, but that's just the executive summary. The report's about that thick. And that task force, led by Joanne Shenandoah and Dee Bigfoot and Anita Fine and so many others, I tried to keep up with them as they went out around Indian country, and I couldn't keep up. I went to Anchorage and Phoenix and Miami, but they went to other places besides. And they really did a good job. That report is really important, and the momentum that report creates is really important. So we are going to continue working to improve things. A lot remains to be done, as so many others have said. One of the major tragedies these days in Indian country continues to be the loss of our children from Indian families. And so one of the reasons I'm here today is because we have a listening session later this afternoon on our BIA Indian Child Welfare Act guidelines for state courts. And we're going to be hearing from people about how to improve those. What we've been hearing is that those guidelines need to be strengthened, improved, and we need regulations in that area to improve the work we're doing in child welfare. So thank you. We've got great partners, by the way, DOJ, and we're working with HHS too, and we really have a chance to make a difference here. Another important initiative we've been doing in Washington, D.C. is working on taking land into trust for tribes. Since 2009, the Obama administration, this government, has taken more than 280,000 acres of land into trust for tribes. And it sounds like you guys know why that's important, because that's the place where tribes can exercise jurisdiction. And that's more than 350 square miles of land. So that really makes a big difference in adding jurisdiction to tribes. And some of you may know we are considering allowing the same thing to happen in Alaska Native communities. We have a rule proposed that we are moving forward on to take land into trust in Alaska. Now, funding is never enough, of course, for any of the work that we do in Indian country, and we're working hard to improve economic developments in Indian country, and we're doing a lot of stuff that's not very exciting. It's kind of boring. We've improved our leasing regulations, we've improved our right-of-way regulations, and we've really been pushing tribes to enact Hearth Act regulations. And this is economic development stuff. Again, it's not sexy, but it's important. And economic development is an important long-term strategy, but it doesn't deal with the crises that you face every day. And last week, President Obama made that really clear to me in a meeting. And last week, we had our Tribal Nations Conference where President Obama and Vice President Biden met with leaders of the Indian tribes. They were all invited to come to Washington, D.C. And we had 11 cabinet members at the meeting. And right the day before the meeting, 12 tribal leaders sat down with President Obama in the Roosevelt Room, which is the room that's right off of the Oval Office, and he sat down and he talked with those tribal leaders. You may recall this summer that the president went to the Standing Rock Reservation in North Dakota. And at that meeting, he met with some kids, and he came back from that meeting very moved, because what he heard from those kids, he heard stories of suicide and drug abuse and suicide attempts and criminal acts and all sorts of victimization and social problems that really affected him, because he was hearing it from kids in their own words. And when he came back, his staff told him that, well, the answer here is economic development. And the president said, no, it's not. The long-term answer is economic development, but the short term is we need to help these kids right now. They can't wait for 20 years or 10 years for economic development to really take hold. And this next part was particularly poignant to me. He recounted this part of this story when he met with these tribal leaders. He said, you know what? Poverty is not what's killing these kids. It's broken hearts that's what's killing these kids. And we have to end poverty, sure. And over the long term, we need to continue to work on doing that. But it's suicide, victimization, drug overdoses, and all sorts of elements of the heart, and the hopelessness that creates. That's the problem we have to work on. Ladies and gentlemen, there's no one else that works harder on those kinds of issues than the people sitting in this room. And I want to thank you. I want to tell you that we in Washington thank you for all the work that you do trying to mend hearts in Indian country. Thank you so much.